Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. A big welcome to all of you. My name is Laura and I'm delighted that you are joining us for today's ESPC community webinar. Today I am joined by Catherine, who will talk to you guys about data integration using Data Factory in Microsoft Fabric. We love hearing what you guys have to say, so remember to join in on the conversation about today's webinar and more on X. Our handle is at ESPC_community. And our hashtag is hashtag ESPC24. Tweet us at us and tell us what you learned. Don't forget to check out our Learning Hub, which is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. You can access and view the Learning Hub by visiting our website, sharepointeurope.com, and clicking the Content tab at the top. Don't let the learning stop here. Continue to keep up and stay ahead by joining us for our next webinar, which is using Lakehouse data at scale with Power BI, featuring direct lake mode with Benny de Jager. This webinar is the second webinar of the brand new Microsoft Fabric Week, and it takes place tomorrow, Tuesday, the 20th of February from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. CET. For more information on this webinar, please check out sharepointeurope.com/Microsoft Fabric Week. The moment we've all been waiting for is finally here. You can now view the European Power Platform Conference 2024 program. Get ready for an immersive experience, hot topics and trends, world-class speakers, interactive panels, engaging tutorials, networking extravaganza, and much, much more. View the fantastic lineup of tutorials, sessions, and networking by visiting sharepointeurope.com/conference schedule 2024 EPPC, and you can find the link there at the bottom of the screen. Here at ESPC, we want to spread the love this Valentine's. That's why we are offering you this limited edition one-time offer, a deal we know you'll fall in love with. Why not infuse a little love into your workday by securing 30% off your ESPC 24 ticket? 2024 is the year to rekindle the flames of your Microsoft 365 passions and inspiration. Discover innovative solutions and time-saving techniques, meet with peers to share and receive ideas, hear the latest news from Microsoft Corporate, and gain genius insight from our knowledgeable speakers. Visit sharepointeurope.com/pricing to snatch up this offer. So after the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any question you might have into the questions window. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. And as always, this webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Centre, where you will be notified by email when it is available. Now I'm going to pass you over to today's webinar presenter, Catherine. Hello, Catherine. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much. All right. Just want to check that you can see my screen now.
Yeah, that looks great.
Perfect. All right, thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm super happy to be here with you today for this first session of the Microsoft Fabric Week. Let's just jump straight into it. Now, if you are working with, different types of projects, whether it is big data and analytics, it could be traditional data warehousing, it could be something cool like artificial intelligence using machine learning or doing data science stuff, you always have one thing that you do need to start with, and that is data, of course. We all need data for our projects. We need it to understand what has happened, or maybe we want to predict what will happen. We need to maybe understand when did it happen or when it will happen in the future, and more importantly, why did it happen? All of these things are scenarios that we need to work on in different types of projects. But before we can do that, we need to get our data. We need to collect it from various different sources. We need to store it in a central location where we can get access to it. We need to probably transform and integrate data. Maybe we need, all right, hopefully my sound is back on. I noticed that was lagging a bit. But yes, we do need to integrate that data. And then we might want to prepare it before we're passing it on to our business users so they can go ahead and actually use it to get insights into their projects. And at some point, someone had an idea of, how can we do all of these things? Maybe we can do something like create a data factory. So that is my session today. We're going to look at how to integrate our data using Data Factory in Microsoft Fabric. My name is Katrine Wilhelmsen, or Catherine Wilhelmsen. My pronouns are she and her, and I currently work as a solutions architect in a Norwegian consultancy called Evidi. On my spare time, I love talking about data. I do things like blogging and speaking. I'm also an organizer and a chronic volunteer. I recently organized a community conference here in Norway called Fabric February. And on my spare time, I also like to renovate a house that I bought a couple of years ago. So if I get a little frustrated at work, I can just tear down a couple of walls and things get better. I'm running out of walls though, so I probably need to find a new hobby soon. You can find me on my website, catherinew.net, and you can also find me on various social media at Catherine W. Just note that there's no E in the middle of my name. That's the Scandinavian spelling. You don't want to give that poor Catherine W all your data and SharePoint tweets. So leave her be and make sure that you just fix that autocorrect if you want to get in touch with me. All right, let's get into it. So before we get into the Fabric Data Factory side of things, I want to just go through a couple of slides on what Microsoft Fabric is. Maybe this is the first time you've heard of it, in which case you probably want to check out the session later this week on the introduction to Fabric itself, where you will get a little bit more of an overview of all the different capabilities. But just to make sure that we're all on the same page here today, I'm going to start with just a very quick introduction. Microsoft Fabric is Microsoft's newest analytics offering. So this is an end-to-end platform or service or offering, depending on what you want to call it. It is a software as a service, SaaS, tool. So it's not where you need to kind of pick and choose the different parts and combine it all together using the Azure portal. It's not very technical and IT pro based like that. It's more coming from the world of Power BI, where you have a service and everything is there for you. So everything has been unified into this nice Fabric tool or offering. And everything has been built from scratch. So even though you might recognize a few things like Data Factory coming from the previous service, Azure Data Factory, or maybe Power BI, which has been a standalone service, all of these things are now integrated into what we call Microsoft Fabric. The architecture is lake-centric, meaning that everything is based on a data lake. And it's the interface itself is tailored to your role. So with all of these different tools to help you get into the experience that you want to use, you have to base it on your role. So if you're a data analyst, you go into Power BI. If you're a data engineer, you can choose to use Data Factory or maybe something like the data engineering experience. All of these different tools are available, like I said. So you have Data Factory, which is what we're going to focus on today. But you also have a different side, which is probably more for those coming from the world of maybe they're coming from Databricks. Maybe they have experience writing Python and Spark code. In that case, you can also use the data engineering tools and experience to do kind of the same thing as you can in Data Factory. There's a little bit of overlap there, but we are going to use the no-code, low-code version today. You have all the different options for storing your data and querying your data. So you have both the more SQL-based data warehouse side of things, where you can use traditional SQL queries to insert, update, delete your data, and so on. But you also have the lakehouse side of things, which is more file-based. So Everything you would need to create an analytics solution is right there for you. And of course, that includes things like data science and real-time analytics, and obviously Power BI, which is what most people use at the end, once you get all of your data through the entire underlying architecture. And then there is also a very cool feature called Data Activator, which is one of the newest features, where you can set up triggers based on your data. So if something happens in your data, maybe you have some sales values going above or below some kind of threshold, you can automatically notify business users so they can take action on that. It's a very cool feature, working straight on top of all the data you already have. So go and check that out if you are interested in that after this session. Like I mentioned, Microsoft Fabric is a lake-centered architecture. Everything that you are working on is built on top of what they call one lake. And it's in the name, you don't have 2 lakes or 3 lakes, you have 1 lake. And the idea is that you have 1 copy of your data. All of the data that is stored in one lake is stored in open file formats, so they can be used by other, competing services or even cloud vendors. But the idea that Microsoft had here is that all the data that you want to store in your platform should be available to everyone, even outside of Microsoft Fabric. And of course, there's also built-in tools for security, governance, and compliance. So all of this is in one nice software as a service offering. Now, with that said, if there are any questions on Microsoft Fabric in general, let's just hold them for the end of today's session. And let's dive into the topic for today, which is Data Factory. Now, I want to start with a little bit of history, just to kind of explain why Data Factory is the way it is in Microsoft Fabric today. Because you may have heard this name being used in other contexts previously. So Data Factory started out as Azure Data Factory back in 2014. This version, we just pretend this never existed. It was horrible, and I apologize to all of you who had to work with it. It was not fun, but it did solve one specific use case. But based off of that, after a couple of years, the Microsoft launched what they called Azure Data Factory version 2. Which is more similar to what we know in Fabric today. This is where they got the user interface, they made it more friendly, and they made it usable for more scenarios than what they had in the very first version. So this was kind of the first version of Azure Data Factory that you could use, and it kind of grew fairly quickly, I would say. And inside of that version, you could do things that we know today. You could ingest data and you could transform data. There were a couple of different tools that you could use, something called mapping data flows and something called wrangling data flows. But after a while, Microsoft decided that they needed to kind of start unifying some of their services. So they took Azure Data Factory and put it into a product called Azure Synapse Analytics. So Data Factory became a component inside of Azure Synapse Analytics. And again, you still had the same kind of offerings, new shiny colors and icons there, but you still had the same offerings for transforming and working with your data. Now, while this was happening, of course, you had Power BI as well. Became a huge success. It grew, I would say, exponentially pretty much. And most people all around the world have heard of Power BI. If they haven't heard of Data Factory, they have probably heard of Power BI. And inside of Power BI, they had like a lightweight version of the kind of ingest and transform tools that you had inside of Azure Data Factory and Azure Synapse Analytics. They were called Dataflows Gen 1, I would say. Now, back in, I think it was May last year in 2023, Microsoft announced Fabric. And this is where we are today. Fabric took the best elements from both the Data Factory side, from the Synapse world, including data warehousing and working with lake houses and Spark notebooks and so on. But they also took the best parts from Power BI and unified all of this together. So you can see, again, new icons, new colors, both the Fabric icon and the Data Factory icon that you can see there on the right side have become shades of green, just to kind of show you that they're taking the best from the blue Azure world and the yellow Power BI world, and they're now merged together in this beautiful product called Fabric. So inside of Fabric Data Factory, we now have some of the same offerings. But what Microsoft did was to take the best component from the Azure Data Factory world, which was the pipelines side of thing, and then the best part from Power BI, which was the data flows or Power Query side of things. So they picked one component from each of these sides and merged them together into Microsoft Fabric. And the reason that I'm showing this to you today is because if you hear words like data factory or data flows, you can get redirected into old documentation on Azure Data Factory or to Power BI Data Flows Gen 1. So you just need to make sure that you include Microsoft Fabric when you're searching for something to just make sure that you get the correct version and the newest version of the tools that you want to learn. So with that said, we are going to dive into the two topics inside of Fabric Data Factory. And the scenarios that we want to go through today, we have three kind of main scenarios that we want to cover. The first one is that we want to ingest data. Ingesting data basically just means collecting data from some kind of source and getting it into our environment where we can do something with it after. In this example here, I'm just illustrating getting data from a website, HTTP, just a regular website, and we want to ingest that data into our solution, into our OneLake. Now that is just, grabbing that data and getting it into our environment. We also probably want to do something with that data. And that's where we want to transform the data. We want to, clean it, we want to merge it, put it together, and make sure that everything is just usable for whoever wants to use that data after us. That is the transformation part. And the third component here is just that overlying part where we want to orchestrate the workflows. We want to ingest our data first and then transform the data. We just need to make sure that we set things up to run in the correct order. And all of these things are solved inside of Fabric Data Factory by using pipelines and data flows. So these tools are fairly, I would say, most of the time used together. You can use pipelines to ingest data, but also to create your workflows. And then data flows are mostly used for transforming data. However, you can also use it to ingest data. So it's a little bit pick and choose what tool works best for you. And we are going to take a look at a couple of examples today. So let's start with our pipelines. Pipelines are what you execute or run. They basically just define your workflow, what you want to do in which order. So inside of your pipeline, you can define the different activities that you want to run or execute. The activities are the individual steps, and you can choose to run them in parallel, just run everything at the same time, or you can chain them and say you want to run this first, this second, and this third, and so on. You can even have different branches. It's very flexible, but it just lets you kind of set up the steps to run and the order in which to run them. These activities, depending on the type of activity, probably connect to some kind of source or a destination. So our connections is, they are where we specify how to connect and how to authorize. So this is depending on the source or the kind of service that you want to connect to. You may need to log in with your company's organizational user, or maybe you need to log in using a username or password, or maybe you don't have to log in at all. Maybe you can be anonymous. All of these things are the connections that we need to define to start working with our data. So fairly simple. Pipelines run activities, and activities have some kind of connections. Those are the kind of core components that you need to know when working with pipelines. Now, in addition to that, I want to call out specifically the copy data activity. This is, I would say, kind of the core component inside of a pipeline when we are thinking about ingesting data. This is a very powerful activity that has some capabilities that is very good for you to be aware of, because they kind of define why you would want to ingest data using pipelines instead of data flows, for example. So when we are working with binary files, and by binary files, I mean everything that isn't, a text file or working with connecting to a database and grabbing data. So this could be, for example, if you want to ingest images from a source that you want to later use in your Power BI reports. In that case, the copy data activity is super simple. You connect to your source, and then you copy whatever file you need into your destination. But if you are working with more complex data, things like databases or source files, you can do some kind of cool things inside of the copy data activity. The first one is that you can serialize or deserialize data. That basically just means converting file formats. So if you are getting some data in let's say, as a CSV file, you can very quickly convert that into data that you can put into your warehouse, for example. Or you can take an Excel file and convert that into a text file. Whatever you want to do, these things are built into the copy data activity. You can also compress or decompress files, zipping or unzipping, probably terms you are more familiar with. So if you have a zip file containing a CSV file, for example, you can both grab that file and then unzip it on the fly, and then work on that data somewhere. You can also choose to define what data you want. So if you have a very big file with hundreds of columns, you can choose to just get a subset of that data. You can also say that this column name, we want to rename that in our destination. So you can set up this mapping explicitly, or you can just choose to take whatever you want and then ingest that into your destination. And this is very important because if you are working with files that are zipped, for example, or you need to read some kind of file format like an Excel file or maybe from an API, for example, all of these things make it, it's very easy to use the copy data activity to load that into one common format inside of our OneLake. So we want to probably store that in a format that is more convenient for using inside of our Microsoft Fabric solution. You can also choose to ingest data using data flows. In case of working with different services, I will show you this in just a minute here in our demos. Data flows support a lot more connections as of today. So this is also a way to ingest data, but you need to make sure that the data is already readable in some kind of format. So if you have a zip file, you probably want to use a pipeline to copy that zip file and unzip it, and then you can use data flows to work on that data later. Data flows is also a way for you to work on complex data transformations. It is Power Query. So if you have worked with Power BI Desktop, for example, or Power BI in general, you are probably familiar with the user interface. It's just a new architecture underneath that lets you work on it at scale. So this is a visual editor, low code experience. I don't want to say no code, but it is low code. And it is very familiar to those of you who have worked with Power BI. So instead of looking at more slides, let's just jump into our Fabric environment and look at both pipelines and data flows and how they work together. So I am going to switch over to my Microsoft Fabric, I would say workspace or interface. As you can see here, this is just a website. So everything that you do it in your browser. by going to app.fabric.microsoft.com. If you are already working with Power BI, you might notice that the user interface is exactly the same. Once you get into this kind of dashboard, this is where you choose your experience based on your role. So for me, for example, working with data, I want to go ahead and work on the data factory experience. And all of these different things have different descriptions that you can read, but mostly when you get in here, you already kind of know what task you want to work on. So in my case here, I'm going to click on Data Factory, and that takes me into the dashboard for the Data Factory experience. Now, you can see at the bottom here, here we go, that I am currently in the Data Factory experience. And this is also a very nice shortcut for me to switch between the different experiences here. So if I wanted to go from working on my data factory, things like pipelines and data flows, I want to switch to my Power BI reports, I can just use this shortcut to change the experience. And if I click on this here, the shortcuts up here are going to change. So inside of my data factory experience, you can see that they are showing me that you probably want to work with data flows or pipelines. But if I switch to another thing like Power BI, if I scroll back up here, you can see that I can create a new report, or I can create a, let's just keep this one. Whoops. That was me messing that up. Click on home. I can create a new report, or I can create other kind of components that I want to use. Same thing inside of the data engineering. You'll see here that in this case, a whole different set of tools, things like notebooks and Spark job definitions. But we also have a few other things like data pipelines. So some of the tools are overlapping between experiences here. But it just kind of reduces the complexity of having all the different things that you want to create inside of Microsoft Fabric into what is probably what you in your role want to work with. So let's switch back into Data Factory. Now, if you are coming from the world of Power BI, you are going to be familiar with the concept of workspaces. Workspaces are just ways where you can separate your different projects into different workspaces, and each workspace can give access to a different set of users. So it's a way of separating both projects and the content that you have, but also a way to enforce security. And in my case here, I have created a workspace called ESPC, which I am currently in. And in here, I can go ahead and create some new content, basically. So if I click on the new button here, this is where you're going to see that, okay, I am in the data factory experience, so I can see the most common tasks on the top, but I can also go ahead and create other things like a lake house or a report. But in my case here, I want to start by creating a data pipeline, because I want to start by ingesting data. I need to get some data before I can actually work on that data. So I'm going to go ahead and create a data pipeline. Let's call this ESPC demo pipeline. Create that one. And that opens up the pipeline interface for me. And again, this is very visual, and they are trying to help you get started and kind of guide you through the entire experience. So even if you haven't seen this before, you probably fairly quickly figure out where to click and what to do with this interface. So in my case here, it says start building your data pipeline. I can choose to add an activity, or I can just start by, okay, copy data. Let's take a look at what that looks like. So when I click on the copy data, it's going to open this wizard for me. And in my case here, you can see on the left side where I can see the different steps that I am going to take. So I'm going to choose my data source. I'm going to connect to it and define that connection, and then choose the destination and just make sure to define how I want to load it into that. Then I'm going to review and save. If you are looking at this for the first time, they have quite a lot of sample data ready for you to explore. Things like COVID data, New York City taxi data, and so on. A couple of different data sets, so you can actually get started using this without having to get access to all of your production data sources. But if you already know what you want to get, you can scroll down and look at the list of data sources here. And you can see that we have a whole different bunch of data sources. And we can also go ahead and reduce that by clicking on this little filter here. And you can see in my case here, under services and apps, we can very easily get data from a SharePoint online list. So if I start by clicking on this one, and go to next, I can choose to create a new connection to my SharePoint site, or I can choose an existing connection. Now, just to save some time here today, I have already created a connection to my demo SharePoint. So if I click on this one and I go to next, I can choose what kind of table or list that I want to get my data from. Now, in this example here today, I have created a little demo list. I know if you are coming from the SharePoint world, you're probably going to laugh at me, but I feel very proud that I created a SharePoint list that I can show you here today. This just pulls out the data from that list. So you can see I just have a simple list with the title, Hello ESPC. Coming from here, I can click on next and then choose where I want to load that data into. And this is also kind of cool because we aren't limited to just ingesting data into our OneLake or our Fabric environment. We can also choose to ingest it into other services that we have access to. So maybe we have an Azure SQL database somewhere else that we want to load it into. Maybe we just want to load it into some kind of blob storage somewhere that we're kind of exporting our data. Or maybe we want to do something with our data and then load it back into CRM, for example. All of these things are scenarios that you might want to run into at some point. But in our case, we are going to get that data into our Fabric environment. So I am going to click on Workspace, and here you can see the different kind of options for storing data that we have inside of Microsoft Fabric. In my case, I want to load my data into a lakehouse. So I'm going to click on Lakehouse and click on Next. And I'm just going to create a new lakehouse, ESPC Lakehouse. And that's it. That's all I have to do to create a lakehouse. For those of you who are familiar with working on data platforms and analytical platforms, Lakehouse is a concept. And previously, you would have to set up quite a lot of things to create your Lakehouse environment. It is just a place where you can store files and then query those files as if they were tables. You can also store tables as just tables. But the first time I saw this, my mind kind of exploded a little bit because instead of having to spend, a couple of hours setting up a full environment and defining the file and table storage, as a software as a service that Fabric is, I just create a lakehouse and I'm done, basically. So once I create my lakehouse here, I can then go ahead and choose whether I want to store this data as a table or as a file. Now I'm going to do the simple option here of saying a table. I'm going to load it to a new table, and you can see it just automatically created the table name based on the list name that I had. And you can also see here that this is where I can choose my different kind of mapping. So if I want to keep all of these different columns, I can just leave it as is, or I can go ahead and say, okay, maybe I don't need this compliance asset ID. So I'm going to just remove that column. And very simple in this interface, I can go ahead and choose what data I want to ingest. Once that is done, it's going to show me an overview that in this example here, I'm going to get data from a SharePoint online list. I'm going to load it into my lakehouse, And I can choose to start the data transfer immediately, or I can disable this one and just let it create the pipeline with the copy activity for me. So I'm not going to run this right now. I want to take a look at the pipeline itself before we do anything. So when I click on OK, it has now created this very simple pipeline for me with that one copy data activity. It has a default name, so let's just say from SharePoint to Lake House, just to make it a little bit more descriptive in here. Now, it had created this copy activity for me through the wizard, but I can also go ahead and just click on these activities that you see on this ribbon here and say add to canvas. In that case, I would have to go through and choose the different options from this little pane down here. So I can choose the sources that I want to get my data from. I can choose to get it from my workspace, from my lakehouses, warehouses, or KQL databases, or I can choose from one of the external connections. I can also go ahead and create new here. So it's the same kind of tool, just depends on whether you want to click through everything yourself or get that little bit more guided experience from that wizard. Same thing on destination. You can see that it's just the same as we saw in the wizard, but here we just have to start from scratch. So let's just delete this one here and look at the copy data activity that we defined in the wizard. So there is a little button down here on the right that says expand. That just makes it a little bit easier to see everything that we have. Now, we are going to recognize all the things we set up, so we can see we are connecting to an external data store. We're connecting to our demo team in SharePoint. I'm using the list called ESPC demo list, and we can also set a few more advanced settings here that they hide from that initial wizard. So if, for example, you want to add an additional column with maybe you want to include the current date as kind of the load date in your destination, so you can see when you loaded that data. You can easily do that from this pane here. You can just define the column and the value that you want. We are not going to do that in our case though. And same thing on the destination. You have the different data stores. We are connecting to our lake house. We can see the new lake house that we created, and we're going to load that into a table. Again, same thing here with a couple of different options. Specifically, the one that is important here is whether you want to append the data, whether you, every time you run this, you want to just add that data to kind of the bottom of that table, or whether you want to overwrite all the data. You just want to empty it and fill it up from scratch. These things are also not set in the wizard. It's a little bit more once you get into working with your pipelines. Under mappings, same thing here. So if we want to, maybe we realize that we changed our mind and we also don't want this, let's see, version, maybe you can go ahead and delete that from this little settings pane. And finally, under settings, just a couple of different options here that we can choose from. We can choose to set the intelligent throughput optimization, which is explained here if you hover over this thing. When you choose auto, the optimal setting is dynamically applied. Probably want to keep that one. However, if you want to say that, okay, here we need a lot of throughput, you can set it up to maximum. In here, we can also choose to say, okay, if we get any data that is corrupted or it's not in the format that we expected in some way, probably more if you grab data from some kind of text file that people can edit themselves, you can very easily choose to skip those incompatible rows from the copy data activity as well. And if you choose to skip them, you can also define that you want to log the output of that so you can take action on it later. And this again is also very convenient. So if you get any data, instead of your entire pipeline and your ingestion part just blowing up and failing, you can just say that skip those rows, log them to somewhere else, and I will deal with them later. Just give me, the basics of what I need here. So we are not going to do that here. We are just going to keep the default settings. Going to minimize this pane here again. And that is basically it for creating that pipeline. So once we have our activity set here, we can go ahead and validate that. We can see that our pipeline has been validated, no errors were found, perfect. Let's just go ahead and run it and see what happens. We're going to save it and then run it. Now, once we do that, we're going to see that this little pane down here switches over to the output pane. And this is where we can monitor our pipelines and the status of those. So we can see here that right now our activity is in progress. We can choose to click on this activity as well to see a little bit more information about what is currently happening in here. So over on this pane here, we can see the same thing, copying from SharePoint to Lakehouse. In this case, we probably know that's what we're doing, but if we have many copy data activities, this is just a very convenient way of seeing what each activity does. It shows us the total duration, start time, status, and so on. So we can actually see that it already succeeded. It wrote one whole row into our lakehouse because I only had one row of demo data. But all of this information here is automatically logged for us. So we can always go back and see what we ran, the number of files or rows that we loaded and ingested, what the throughput was, and basically all the information that we need from our ingestion side. So here I can also drill down and we can see here that, part of the total duration was just, waiting to connect to that SharePoint service, and then the rest of it was actually transferring that data. So if you do need to do some kind of optimization, everything is built into this tool for you. Super simple, very convenient, and you don't have to spend time creating like this whole logging, auditing framework. So I love this, very easy to use, very easy to monitor. Now, once this is done, we can go ahead and take a look at the data that we actually loaded. So we can close out this pipeline over here on the left side in our menu. I'm just going to close this. And inside of our demo workspace, we can see that we now have our lakehouse that we created from that wizard. So if we open up this lakehouse, we just want to confirm that we actually ingested data into our solution. It's just going to load that preview for us. Here we go. A little slow on the first run, just one row of data, but it is easier the second time you open it up. So now we can see here that inside of our lakehouse, we have that one table, and we can see all the data that we got from our SharePoint list. Very simple. In just, I would say, 10, 15 minutes, I have created the start of a lakehouse, getting data from SharePoint, and now we can go ahead and ingest data from other sources, creating more pipelines, and so on. From here, we can also choose to, up here in the right corner, we can switch from what is called the lakehouse view, where we can look at our data and we can look at our files, and we can switch to our SQL analytics endpoint. This is also really, really cool. This means that we can look at the same data here, but we can query it using SQL. Now, in our case, we just created this lakehouse, so it's going to take a few more, I would say, minutes probably to set up this analytics endpoint. But once we do that, we can go ahead and type SQL queries on our files that are stored in our OneLake, which is really, really cool. But for now, let's go ahead and look at data flows as well, just to see how those work. So when we click on New here, I'm going to choose to create a data flow instead of a pipeline. And we're going to see that we have a slightly different user interface. In here, this is just Power Query, like I've said a couple of times now. If you have worked with it, should be familiar. If you haven't, you're going to get a lot of help just from the user interface. Just take your time to click around and look at all the different things that you can do. In here, I can go ahead and get data from a whole set of sources. So you can see here that it's actually showing me that I can connect to a SharePoint folder. I can grab a file from there, for example. Or if I click on View More, I can see all the different connections that we have. So what you're going to notice is that inside of data flows, we can connect to a lot more services than we can inside of the pipeline. So this is more on the ingestion side of data flows. So let's just give it a go and say, can I connect to my, my SharePoint folder here? Let's just see if I can open up my folder, and just to verify that I do actually have a file in there, and copy that one. Let's see if I can create a new connection, and it looks okay to me. So I actually haven't tested this. We're doing live demos here now, but it works. So in this case here, it connects to my, my SharePoint folder that contains one of our files here. And I can go ahead and create this connection. And that opens up this Power Query interface where I can go ahead and go and work on that data. So let's just see if this works here. So we're importing our Excel notebook. We can see that I have one sheet in here. So I'm going to just expand that sheet and look at the data in there. And you can see that it's creating a couple of different steps for us automatically. And we can see now that we got the data that was in our workbook. Very simple, one row of data, just with a date, the author, and a comment. So hello, ESPC. And you can see that it also automatically detected some of the file types here. You can see that it changed the column type. It detected that the date column was of type date, while the others are just text. So it can do quite a lot of things very easily out of the box, helping us with this. But I can also go ahead and work on this data, and I can do quite a lot of things. So for example, if I want to look at the date and I want to, let's say I want to change it into a date or time, or if I click on date and I go to the transform part up here, I can go ahead and do a couple of other things. So I can, well, maybe extracting the characters doesn't make a whole lot of sense from date here, but if we click on date here, I can go ahead and extract, let's say, the year. So if I click on extract the year, it's going to change that column into just the year for me. So a lot of things that you can do. You basically just have to find, work on your own data, and then look at all the different options for the columns that you have here. You can merge things, you can change things, you can replace, you can do pretty much anything that you need to do with that data. But I am going to just remove this last step here and just keep it very simple for now. So once I've transformed my data, or in this case here, I've ingested it from an Excel file in SharePoint instead of getting it from a list that we did in the pipeline, I can go ahead and choose where to load that data into. So down here on the right side, you can see the data destination. We can also see this from the ribbon on top here, where we can add destination. You just have to pick and choose whatever works best for you. So I am going to choose Lakehouse again, and I am going to load this into a new table in that Lakehouse. So I just want to browse down into my ESPC lakehouse and choose ESPC demo table. Let's call it that. I'm going to choose to replace all the data every time I load it, or I can also choose to append the data and just add more rows every time I load it. Let's just do replace for now. So I'm going to save that. And once we're done with everything, I'm going to click on the publish button down here in the bottom corner, just to make sure that everything has been saved. We're going to publish that data flow, and we are going to also run the data flow once we do that. So you can see that I actually forgot to change the name, so it's just called data flow 1, but let's just go with that. So this is now being published, and once it's published, it's going to go ahead and refresh that. I'm not going to let you sit there and wait for that one. So I am going to go back into my demo pipeline and just show you a couple of different options here for creating our workflows. So our first step here was we ingested some data using a copy data activity. Now we want to make sure that we also ingest that data using a data flow. So under settings here, I can select my data flow 1 data flow and choose to load that in parallel. You can see that these are completely separate. So if I now run this pipeline again, it's going to run both of these activities at the same time. But I can also choose, okay, only load this data if the first one succeeds. Or maybe getting data from this Excel file could be kind of a backup option if this first one fails. So I can say if the first one fails, go ahead and run that next one. Or I can just say run them in parallel. And if you are kind of like me, a little bit pedantic on how to, make sure that things look pretty, there is under view here a nice little auto align button that fixes things for you automatically. Now, the final step here is that we probably don't want to go in and run this pipeline every time we want to update our data. So we can also define our schedule and say that I want to go ahead and run this. I can do it down to by the minute, or I can do it, maybe I just want to run it once a week. So every week on, let's say, Friday at, let's do 6 p.m. I'm going to choose that one. And I can also choose whether I want to start running it immediately, in which case it's going to run on the first next Friday. Or I can just say you want to start this in March, for example. We don't want to run it in February, we want to start it in March. But in our case, I'm just going to leave it as is. And I can also choose which time zone this time works for. So I can choose my time zone, or maybe we want to run it in UTC time. So once we have that, we can go ahead and schedule that. I'm not going to do that now because I don't want to run this, and I am probably going to forget to turn it off. But that is the easy way of doing that. So let's start wrapping this up by switching back to our slides. I want to make sure that we have enough time for Q&A here. So I just want to call out a few things when it comes to orchestration, the way that we saw there at the end. Orchestration is probably a term you're going to hear. That is just defining our workflows. You can also use it to configure alerts and error handling. Like I said, you can choose to set if one activity fails, do something else. But you can also use some of the built-in functionality for you can send a message to a Teams channel, or you can send an email. So if an activity fails and this is a critical activity, send a message to Teams so someone can go ahead and look into that and fix that error immediately. Or you can just send an email to maybe a customer. If you have fixed all of your data, everything has run successfully, you've exported that into somewhere else, you can send an email to your customer. All of these things are also things that you can do inside of a pipeline, which is part of the orchestration concept. And finally, we want to add that schedule. Now, like I mentioned, there are a couple of different dependencies, and this is slightly easier to show in a slide here. For example, if it runs successfully, you want to do something on success, you can choose that by selecting the green arrow. You can also choose to log a failure, or maybe not even log it, but just to run an activity on failure. And there is also one on completion. So whether the first one runs successfully or fails, it doesn't matter, you're always going to do that next step. There is also one that is slightly tricky, which is called on skipped. I think it's called skipped. Maybe there is a different word for it. But that is only executed if the previous task has not been run. So in this case here, if the first activity runs successfully, we're going to run the next one on success. We're also going to run on completed, but we're not going to run the on failure or skipped, because this first task here, it actually ran. We're not going to run the next one. In the opposite example, if the first activity fails, we are going to run the failure activity and the completion. And in this case, we are going to log or run the skipped activity because the successful activity did not run. So I added this here. I will make sure to share this slide deck as well, so you can reference that if you want to. It's just slightly easier to show it here than having to drag all of those activities out. And then finally, a quick note on dependencies. If you want to do something on failure, it would be, I would say, intuitive to just drag these red arrows down to that same activity. Unfortunately, that is it works as a logical and. So this activity that you want to run, it only runs if all of these three activities fail. So just be aware of that. You do need to set up one kind of, I would say, error handling activity for each failure. We're crossing our fingers that it might be easier to do that in the future, but for now, just be aware of this little gotcha. We're not going to demo anything more because I ran through it all in the first demo, but we are going to skip back and see if we have any questions for the last minutes of our session today. So I'm not sure if I can see any questions, but in that case, hopefully you can unmute and send them to me or read them to me.
Thanks, Catherine, for a great webinar and a great demo. So there are a couple of questions in here. So the first one I see is, someone is asking, does Fabric support Dynamics 365 sales?
Yes, I would say so. As long as the data is in Dataverse, you can grab it from there. But I also think that the Dataflow has a connection to Dynamics directly. But like I said, I think there are over 150 connections. I don't know the details of every single one, but I know Dynamics is one that is supported, yeah.
Brilliant, thanks, Catherine. So the next question then is, considering the history of ADF, do we need to wait for Fabric 2.0?
No, I would say actually a very good question. I would say that Fabric is kind of the version that we were hoping for when it was launched. So if you were kind of, if you looked at what happened with Synapse, we all thought that Synapse was going to be that unified experience, but then out of the blue, Microsoft came and launched Fabric. But Fabric is now taking the best from Power BI, which has been around for years, and the same thing with Synapse and Data Factory, which has been around for years. So I would say that Fabric is actually fairly complete in terms of features right now. There are things missing that are on the roadmap, but they are working actively on getting that out in 2024. And we're hoping that the first set of new features is coming now in the first quarter. So by the end of March, we should see some of the features that we are still missing as of today should be available.
Brilliant. Thanks, Catherine. So the next question then is, the demo pipeline took 35 seconds to load a single row of data using auto optimization. How does it perform on larger data sets?
So also a great question. All of this looks fairly slow when working on small sets of data because we are using an architecture and a feature that is built for cloud scale, for enterprise scale. So it actually functions a lot better when you have larger sets of data, because loading one row, if that takes 30 seconds, we're all going to say, isn't that super slow? But you can also load, I would say, 100,000 rows in the same amount of time, because the time it takes to load it, it's based on connecting to that data source. It's kind of setting up all the back-end features that is hidden from view for now, since this is a software as a service. So there is a little bit of spin-up time. So for small sets of data, it can look pretty slow, but once you work on more, I would say, realistic sets of data, it is very, very fast. And it can load petabytes of data, terabytes, gigabytes, whatever you have. It has been tested for performance, and it works great with that as well. So I would say the only thing it looks weird for is small amounts of demo data.
Brilliant. Thanks, Catherine. So I think you might have touched on the next question, but I'll just ask it anyways. So someone is wondering how loading one line could last such a long time. Is this due to cold start, or what process is underneath?
Yes, it's also because in my demo today, remember that I actually created a new lake house as well. So it had to kind of spin up everything and create those objects, as well as connect to our source for the very first time. So I would say if I reran this, it could take just a couple of seconds. So for my next demo, I will make sure to have everything kind of warmed up so it doesn't look as slow.
Fantastic. Thanks, Catherine. So there's just one last question, and someone is wondering, can Fabric ingest APIs?
Yes, it can. So you can connect to APIs using both a pipeline, copy data activity, or a data flow. It is, as long as you understand how to use the API, it's fairly simple to set that up. But you can connect to databases, to APIs, to files in whatever storage. And you can also, in Fabric, create what is called shortcuts to other cloud storage. So maybe if you have something in Amazon S3 buckets or in Google Cloud, you can create shortcuts to those and get easy access to your data from there as well without actually ingesting it. So any kind of scenario, you are pretty much covered in Fabric.
Fantastic. Thanks a million, Catherine, for answering all those questions. So that concludes the Q&A session. I don't see any more questions coming in there. So just on behalf of the ESPC community, I just want to extend a huge thank you again, Catherine, for taking the time to carry out this webinar today. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it. And if there are any other questions that came up during the Q&A, or maybe if you're watching the recording, please feel free to reach out to me on my blog or on social media, or send me an email. And I'll also be happy to connect with you on LinkedIn. You should be able to find me there with my name. Oops. So thank you so much for having me. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Microsoft Fabric week.
Fantastic. So that is the end of today's webinar. You can find this webinar and more at sharepointeurope.com/resource center. Thanks again to everyone for joining us today, and I hope that you'll join us again soon. Bye for now.
Bye.